Hi everyone, my name is Will McNamara, and today I'm going to be going over my practice observation. I chose to do a high school near me, Plum Area High School, and I observed one of their hockey practices. So let's get into the presentation here. Just a little background on Plum hockey, my relationship with it, and just how the practice was set up. Um, I'm a close friend with one of the assistant coaches, Coach Sunday. He's been there for about 2 years now, I believe. So that was kind of my in to this practice. This practice actually did take place after playoffs ended, and it was the first skate of the off season. So this was a practice, it wasn't necessarily preparing them for games. It was more of a conditioning and just a skate to keep everyone fresh. And the team also will be holding summer skates in the future throughout the summer to keep the players fresh. So that's just something I wanted to include. Um, just some details here about the practice. Not very long. It was an hour and 15 minutes long, which for a hockey practice isn't anything crazy. I counted 16 skaters on the ice, not including the two goalies. And one thing I found interesting was equipment like tennis balls and tires were featured during this practice, which isn't something you see very often, at a hockey practice. So that was definitely something that caught my eye right off the beginning. And yeah, it was certainly something I wanted to include in my reflection and in this slideshow. So when I was observing the coaches, there were three coaches, the head coach, and then two assistants. The first thing I noticed was just how loud they were. Um, their voices kind of filled up the whole rink, and they kind of had this demanding presence that the players just seemed very connected to and respected. The instruction they gave was very clear at all times. There wasn't, their words were always very clear, and it wasn't a question of what was going on. And when effort was something that was preached throughout the entire practice. It doesn't matter, at the end of the day, if you do the drill right, um, it's about how hard you're working. That's how these coaches felt. So the emphasis was on the intensity for these players, not perfecting the drills. When it came to demonstrating drills, coaches were very, very involved in demonstrating, and they often would pick two or three players and have them aid in the demonstrations too. So that was something else I noticed. And between drills, coaches were extremely quick to set up the equipment for the next drill after the previous one had been completed. So that was definitely something I noticed. Um, I did some observing of just the players as well, and as I mentioned earlier, players were always pretty engaged, and seemed very attentive to the coaches during instruction. One thing that I did notice that caught my eye and was a bit surprising, there was love like between drills. There was love, casual conversation, and like banter between mainly the assistant coaches and the players. Now, this is something that I actually do support as a hockey player myself. I think that you need to be able to kind of have that friendly at times relationship with your coach where you can kind of mess around. But I think the important part is knowing when to flip that switch between being a friend and a coach. And yeah, I just found it pretty interesting that at the high school level there was that much kind of like banter and back and forth between players and coaches. And as I mentioned, that pretty much throughout the entire practice, there was very high effort, high intensity levels, and the communication between players during drills at the high school level was very shockingly just wonderful. The players were always talking, communicating on the ice, yelling for the puck, things like that, which is something you really do like to see at this level. So that was something that I noticed and wanted to make note of. So some of the biggest just takeaways I have after watching this practice was at the high school level, players seem to be pretty receptive to that strong, demanding coaching presence that I mentioned earlier. Um, Another thing that I took away from this practice was stopping drills to give instruction. It can disrupt the flow of practice, but at the same time, it can improve the quality of the drill that's being performed. So, that's a sacrifice that you're going to kind of have to make if you want to be able to, if a drill's not going well and you're a coach and you want to see it just done better, you're going to have to blow the play dead and just kind of disrupt any flow that's going on to make that correction. And that's something that these coaches were not afraid to do and did quite often, actually. And establishing a one-on-one conversation with players during practice is necessary to make players feel valued. As I mentioned, throughout practice, oftentimes the head coach and assistant coaches did not hesitate to give a player just some one-on-one feedback after a rep of a drill, whether or not they did it correctly or not. And then not only does that, let them know what they're doing right and doing wrong, it also helps these players feel very valued and seen and appreciated during practice, which is something that I feel like coaches may not think about often. So that was also something I took away from this. And lessons learned. Being vocal and having a strong presence is it's key as a hockey coach. If you can't, bring that voice and bring that demanding leading presence, you're not going to have the respect of your team. And at this level, that's something you need. Do not be afraid to give criticism or feedback to a player during a drill. As I mentioned, it might disrupt the flow of practice a little bit, but if you want to see success and you want to see improvement, you have to be able to give that criticism, to a player, because they're going to remember what they did wrong. There's a higher chance they're going to remember what they did wrong if you correct them, right after the drill's over, compared to if you wait till the very end of practice. So that was another lesson I learned. The flow and timing of drills is extremely important for an effective practice. This one's important because, since this practice was over only an hour and 15 minutes, the coaches had to be very, very precise and really know when they wanted to start and end a specific drill if they wanted to get all the drills they wanted to do, in. So it was pretty obvious that they knew exactly when they were going to start the drills, when they were going to stop the drills, and as I mentioned, they were very quick to set up drills, but they were very quick to set up the next drill after one had ended. So that's something that I noticed and I found very important. And probably the biggest thing I noticed and the biggest lesson that I learned throughout this practice is just watching these kids play. It was obvious they were having a lot of fun, despite the fact that, the coaches were still being pretty intense and it was a very demanding practice. There was still that lighthearted nature to the practice. At the end of the day, it is just a game. So I think, encouraging that fun, that camaraderie, and just making sure everyone enjoys themselves is the most important part at the end of the day. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. I really enjoyed being able to do this, being able to watch this practice, and there were definitely some things I took away and some lessons that I learned that will stick with me as I go on my journey to become a hockey coach myself, hopefully. So, yeah, I really enjoyed this, and that's about it.